The trucks rumbled over the hot American roads, their wheels kicking up clouds of dust as the sun blazed overhead. Inside, the German women sat in uneasy silence, their faces grim with exhaustion and the weight of captivity. The oppressive summer heat pressed down on them, thick and suffocating, as they journeyed further into the heart of a country they had never imagined setting foot in. It was a strange place, vast and foreign, and they couldn't shake the feeling that they were moving deeper into an unknown world. It was the summer of 1945, just weeks after the official surrender of Nazi Germany. The war had ended, but for these women, it felt as though the conflict still had a grip on their lives. Their uniforms, once symbols of duty and honor, were now nothing more than tattered remnants. Their once proud positions in the German military had been stripped away, leaving them prisoners in a foreign land, their future uncertain. Leutnant Erika Müller, a young communications officer, sat among them, her back pressed against the rough wooden side of the truck. The truck's engine roared beneath her, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about the war, about the destruction, the endless fighting, and the life she had left behind. All of it seemed like a dream now, a nightmare she could hardly remember clearly. The smell of burning buildings, the cries of fallen comrades, the harsh order to fight for a cause that had led to ruin. It all seemed to fade into a distant memory as the landscape around her changed. The truck jolted as it hit another bump in the road, and Erika gripped the edge of the wooden bench, steadying herself. She couldn't remember the last time she had slept properly. Days had turned into weeks since her capture, and every moment had felt like an eternity. They had been transported from one camp to another, shuffled around like cattle, with no clear understanding of what was happening to them. The fear that clung to them now was not just from the war, but from the uncertainty of the future. What did the Americans want with them? Were they just prisoners of war, or was something more awaiting them? She glanced at the other women in the truck. Most of them were young, barely out of their teens, their faces still soft, unmarked by the years of war. Others were older, their eyes reflecting the deep weariness of those who had seen too much. They were all silent, their minds trapped in the same fog of fear and confusion. Some clutched their coats tightly, others simply stared at the road ahead, as if willing themselves to understand what was happening. But for all their quiet, there was a shared understanding among them. They were no longer soldiers, no longer enemies. They were prisoners. The truck slowed as it approached a checkpoint. The women stiffened instinctively, unsure of what to expect next. The convoy came to a halt, and a pair of American soldiers approached the truck, their boots kicking up dust as they walked toward the driver. They exchanged a few brief words before one of the soldiers motioned for the women to disembark. "Get out!" the soldier barked, his voice sharp but not unkind. Erika stepped down from the truck, the harsh sunlight blinding her for a moment as she blinked against the brightness. The heat hit her like a wall, and she felt sweat bead on her forehead instantly. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, trying to ignore the discomfort as she surveyed the camp. It was unlike any military facility she had ever seen before. There were no towering fences, no electrified barriers, just rows of wooden barracks and tents stretching out into the distance. The soldiers, a mix of young men and women, moved casually, almost leisurely, as they carried out their duties. Some exchanged jokes, others shared quiet words, but there was a distinct lack of the tension Erika had come to expect from soldiers. The women were herded into a group and directed toward one of the barracks. It was a simple structure, but it looked clean, pristine compared to the squalor they had endured in their previous camps. Inside, rows of beds were lined up neatly, and the air was surprisingly fresh, with the scent of new wood and the faint smell of grass wafting through the open windows. It was the sort of place that might have once been a summer camp, the kind of place children went to play, far from the horrors of war. But now it was a holding pen for women who had once been part of an enemy army. The women were told to sit and wait. Erika noticed how each of them sat quietly, some with their heads down, others staring blankly ahead, their minds undoubtedly filled with the same questions that plagued her own thoughts. Where were they? What was going to happen to them now? They were all still wearing their German uniforms, gray, worn, and torn in places, and their faces betrayed the exhaustion and fear that had settled in deep within them. They had been brought here like cattle, with no understanding of why, no answers to the questions that haunted them. The war was over, but the fear of what was to come next lingered, hanging in the air like a heavy fog. As Erika sat in the quiet barracks, she tried to steady her breath. The silence was thick, but in it, she could hear the faint sounds of the camp beyond, the rustle of leaves in the trees, the distant hum of voices, the occasional sound of a door opening or closing. It felt almost peaceful here, like a strange, disorienting dream. But there was no escaping the reality of what they had become. Prisoners. The war had stripped them of everything, and now they were at the mercy of the Americans. The very people they had been taught to hate, the people they had fought against for so long, were now the ones who held their fate in their hands. Erika's heart raced with an emotion she couldn't name. Was this the end, or the beginning of something else? Just as the tension in the air seemed unbearable, the door to the barracks opened, and a soldier stepped in. His uniform was neat and pressed, and his face was calm, but there was something in his eyes that set him apart from the others. He wasn't just a soldier. There was a sense of authority about him, something that demanded attention. "All of you, follow me," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. Erika stood up, her legs trembling slightly as she followed the others out of the barracks. They were led through the camp, past rows of tents and soldiers going about their duties. It felt like a dream, a surreal, disorienting dream. But the heat, the smell of fresh air, the sounds of distant laughter, all of it made it seem oddly normal. But in the back of her mind, Erika knew that this was just the beginning. The questions were only starting, and the answers were yet to come. What would they be fed? What would their lives be like here? And most pressing of all, would they ever be free again? As the soldier led them further into the camp, Erika couldn't shake the feeling that their story was far from over. There was still so much they didn't know, so much they couldn't yet understand. The road ahead was uncertain, and the weight of that uncertainty pressed down on her chest, heavy and suffocating. For now, all she could do was follow, step by step, through this strange new world. But deep inside, Erika knew one thing for certain. Everything was about to change. The heat of the summer was unrelenting. Even though it was late afternoon, the sun still hung in the sky like a fiery orb, casting long shadows over the camp. The German women, now settled in their barracks, were left to grapple with the weight of their new reality. Their bodies ached from the long journey, the truck ride, and the fear that gnawed at their insides. They sat in silence, the kind that comes from too much thought, too many questions, and no answers. Erika sat on the edge of her bunk, her hands clasped tightly together, trying to steady her breath. She had seen the looks on the other women's faces as they had entered the camp. The same confusion, the same uncertainty. But there was something else in their eyes now, a sense of distrust, of wariness. They were all too familiar with the ways of soldiers, the ways of men in power. They knew what it meant to be captured by an enemy, to be at the mercy of those who had once been seen as foes. Erika's mind was restless. She kept thinking about her father, her family, the way the world had shifted beneath her feet. She had been raised to believe in the righteousness of her country's cause. She had been trained to believe that they were fighting for something greater, something noble. But now in this place, under the harsh sun and among these strangers, she was starting to question everything. What had it all been for? What had the war truly accomplished? "Erika, are you okay?" A voice pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to find Ingrid, a young woman barely out of her teens, standing at the foot of her bunk. Ingrid had a look of concern on her face, but Erika could see the same unease in her eyes. "I'm fine," Erika replied, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. "Just thinking." Ingrid nodded, her brow furrowed. "I don't like this. I don't trust them." Erika understood. The others felt the same way. The rumors that had swirled through the camps before they were transported here had painted the Americans in all sorts of lights. Some said they were kind, others said they were ruthless. No one really knew the truth, and in a place like this, where so much was uncertain, the unknown was terrifying. But Ingrid wasn't the only one who was wary. Around the barracks, the other women were speaking in hushed tones, casting nervous glances toward the soldiers who occasionally walked past. They were all the same age, it seemed, in their late 20s or early 30s. They wore their uniforms with a mixture of authority and ease, their faces hard to read. Some of the women speculated that the Americans had been kind so far simply because they were still processing the end of the war. But others, like Ingrid, were convinced that it was all just a front, that something worse was coming, and they were merely being kept docile until it was time for the true brutality to begin. As the days wore on, the tension between the soldiers and the prisoners grew, though it was more subtle than anything outwardly violent. The soldiers were polite, even courteous at times, but there was an underlying unease in their interactions with the women. It wasn't that they were cruel, it was just that they seemed to be constantly on edge, as if they were waiting for something. The camp itself was quiet, almost too quiet. The women were given tasks to do, light work, cleaning, organizing, some even helped in the camp kitchen. But none of it was enough to distract them from the looming uncertainty. It was in the mess hall one afternoon that things began to change. The women had finished their lunch, a bland but filling meal of beans and bread, when a group of soldiers entered the room, carrying something unusual. The women froze as the soldiers set down large metal boxes with lids on the floor. The boxes were clinking, and the sound sent a ripple of curiosity through the room. "What is this?" Ingrid whispered, leaning toward Erika. "I don't know," Erika murmured back, watching as the soldiers began to open the boxes. The contents inside were not immediately clear, but there was a faint smell of something sweet, something cool. One of the soldiers, a tall man with brown hair and a square jaw, turned toward the women. His name was Sergeant James Anderson, and Erika had noticed him before. He was one of the few soldiers who had spoken to the women with something resembling kindness. He met their eyes now, his face softening into a smile. "Ladies," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "we've got something special for you today." He opened one of the boxes, revealing rows of small glass bottles filled with a brown liquid. Then, with another gesture, he opened a second box, this one filled with small containers of what looked like frozen white dessert. Erika's breath caught. She had heard of Coca-Cola, of course, but never thought she would see it here, in a place like this. She had heard that the Americans drank it by the gallon, but she had never imagined tasting it herself. And the ice cream, the idea of it seemed almost too foreign to be real. The other women watched with wide eyes, unsure whether to approach or stay back. It wasn't just the unfamiliarity of the treats, it was the gesture itself. Why would the Americans offer them something like this? Was it a trap? A way to lure them into submission? Sergeant Anderson stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the women. "We thought you could use something to make the day a little easier. It's not much, but, well, we've got a little treat for you." He held out a bottle of Coca-Cola to Ingrid, who hesitated for a moment before reaching out and accepting it. The ice-cold bottle felt strange in her hands, and she stared at it as if it were some kind of artifact from another world. The other women shifted in their seats, some looking away, others daring to take a step closer. Anderson passed out more bottles, one by one, until every woman had a small bottle in her hands. "Go ahead," Anderson said with a grin, his voice soft. "You've earned it." The silence in the room was palpable. The women sat still, not sure whether to drink, eat, or simply refuse. But then slowly one of them, Eva, a middle-aged woman with short graying hair, unscrewed the cap of the Coca-Cola. She raised the bottle to her lips and took a small sip. The reaction on her face was immediate. Her eyes widened in disbelief, and she let out a small, surprised laugh. "Oh my God," she whispered. It's sweet." Her voice was a mixture of awe and disbelief. The other women followed suit, unsure at first, but curiosity pushing them forward. They took tentative sips, and as they did, something shifted in the air. The tension, which had been hanging over them like a storm, began to ease, if only for a moment. The fizzy sweetness of the Coke spread through their bodies, and for a fleeting second, it felt like a taste of something far removed from war. It was a taste of something normal. As they drank, the soldiers stepped back, watching them with quiet interest. Anderson was still smiling, his hands behind his back as he observed their reactions. But just as the women began to relax into this strange moment, the boxes with the ice cream were opened. The frozen dessert sat there, white and smooth, each serving as a small scoop of something unfamiliar and almost decadent. One by one, the women hesitantly took the small bowls, staring at the icy treats as though they were delicate treasures. Some took a bite, their expressions softening as the cold sweetness filled their mouths. The taste was nothing like what they had known before, creamy, rich, and impossibly cold in the heat of the summer. It was almost too much to process. In a world where survival was the only thing that mattered, something as simple as ice cream felt like a distant dream. Erika watched the other women, their guarded expressions slowly dissolving into something softer. For the first time in a long while, she saw them smile. Not because of a victory, not because of an escape, but because of something as simple as a taste. The sense of disbelief was palpable, but so was something else, a flicker of humanity that neither the war nor captivity could take away. Erika took a deep breath, the tension in her chest loosening, even if just for a moment. She raised the bottle of Coca-Cola to her lips and took a sip. The fizzy sweetness was a burst of life in the middle of this strange, quiet camp. It didn't make the war go away. It didn't change their fate. But it did something else. It made them feel, for just a moment, like human beings again. And that was enough to stir something deeper, a fragile hope that maybe the world was not entirely lost. The evening air in the camp had turned cooler, a soft breeze drifting in from the west. The women had finished their meager dinner, and the day's tasks had all been completed. Yet something felt off. A sense of unease was building in the camp, creeping into the corners of the barracks, making the air feel thick and heavy. Erika sat on the edge of her bunk, her mind racing, her thoughts tangled in a web of uncertainty and fear. She had tasted the Coca-Cola and ice cream, those fleeting moments of comfort, and had felt for the first time since her capture that perhaps the Americans were different from what she had been told. But now that small seed of hope was being tested in ways she hadn't anticipated. The morning had started like any other. The women were given their usual tasks, cleaning and helping in the kitchen, nothing out of the ordinary. But by midday, word began to spread among the prisoners that something had changed. Some of the women had seen soldiers moving with a new sense of urgency. The sounds of trucks arriving echoed throughout the camp, their engines roaring as they came to a halt at the gate. The air felt charged, thick with the promise of something inevitable. Erika couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. She and Ingrid were sitting together, talking in hushed tones when Sergeant Anderson entered their barracks, his usual easy demeanor replaced with an air of seriousness. He stepped to the front of the room, his eyes scanning the women as they turned to look at him. His face was stern, his jaw set in determination. "Listen up," he said, his voice low but firm. "We've just received orders. The camp is to be placed on high alert. There are rumors of German soldiers still operating in the area. Stragglers, not part of the official surrender. The officers want us to be prepared for anything. That means extra patrols tonight." A murmur ran through the room. The women exchanged uneasy glances, some more fearful than others. It wasn't the first time they'd heard of such rumors. The war was over, but it seemed like the fallout was far from finished, and now the sense of safety they had begun to feel was slipping away. "What are you asking of us?" Ingrid spoke up, her voice shaky. "What's going to happen?" Anderson didn't immediately respond, his gaze flickering to the other soldiers standing in the doorway, their expressions just as grim. When he finally spoke, his tone was quieter, almost apologetic. "We're just following orders, but I want you all to be on guard. Keep your heads down, stay in your barracks. We don't know if these rumors are true, but we can't afford to take chances." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them. Erika could feel her heart pounding in her chest. There had been whispers among the women, rumors that some of the soldiers might not be as kind as they seemed. What if the rumors weren't about German soldiers still in hiding, but about something darker? What if the Americans were beginning to lose their patience with the prisoners? Erika's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of boots marching outside, the rumble of vehicles, the unmistakable sound of soldiers preparing for something. She looked at Ingrid, who seemed equally unsettled. They had been prisoners for so long, and now as tension began to mount in the camp, the thin veneer of safety they had built for themselves felt like it was cracking. Later that evening, Erika found herself pacing the barracks, her mind racing. Something was wrong. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the air was thick with impending danger. The soldiers had been more on edge than ever, their movements more frantic. The Americans had always seemed so human, so full of compassion, but now the compassion seemed to be slipping away. Suddenly, the door to the barracks burst open. A soldier stood in the doorway, panting heavily, his face flushed with anxiety. It was Corporal Thompson, one of the younger soldiers who had been kind to the women on occasion. He was breathing heavily, his eyes wide with fear. "There's been an incident," he said quickly, his voice shaky. "Some of the German soldiers, they found us. They're on the move. We need to act fast." The women stood frozen, uncertainty flashing in their eyes. Erika's stomach tightened. She had heard of these isolated German holdouts, small bands of soldiers who had refused to surrender, still fighting in the shadows of the war. But the thought of them attacking an American camp seemed impossible. Yet here it was, unfolding before them. The soldier's gaze turned to Anderson, who had moved to the front of the room. The calm, composed demeanor that had once marked the sergeant was gone. His eyes were narrowed, and his mouth was set in a hard line. "Get the women ready," Anderson ordered, his voice firm. "Move them to the back of the camp now." A sense of dread washed over Erika as she moved with the others to the back of the barracks. She had been here long enough to know that when soldiers started issuing orders in such a manner, something serious was happening. The chaos outside had escalated quickly. Gunfire, shouting, the unmistakable sounds of a battle. Erika's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Should they stay hidden? Should they try to escape? She had heard nothing about this before. Nothing about the threat of attack. The feeling of betrayal gnawed at her. Was this all a lie? Was she, along with the others, nothing more than pawns in a larger game? Had the kindness they had been shown been nothing but a ruse? But just as the panic began to rise, the door to the barracks opened again. This time, it was Captain Miller, the officer who had spoken to them on their first day. His usual calm was gone, replaced with a tight-lipped determination. His eyes swept over the women, his face grim. "We have to go," he said urgently. "There's no time. We're being overrun." Erika's heart skipped a beat. The camp, once a place of tentative peace, had become a battleground. The world she thought she understood had just shattered. The women were herded out of the barracks, the chaos of the camp swelling around them. The soldiers, still in full combat gear, scrambled to defend their positions. Erika's stomach twisted as she realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't a simple escape. They were caught in the crossfire of something much bigger, and their fate now rested in the hands of men who might or might not care about their survival. And then, in the midst of the growing chaos, something strange happened. A familiar face appeared in the crowd. Sergeant Anderson. He moved toward Erika with determination, but there was something different in his eyes now. There was no longer the easy smile, no longer the kindness that had once seemed to define him. He was hard, focused. Erika felt a cold pit form in her stomach. She didn't trust him anymore. "Stay close to me," he ordered, his voice low. "We'll get you to safety." But Erika hesitated. Something in her gut told her that there was more to this than she was seeing. A choice loomed before her. Should she stay with Anderson and follow his orders? Or should she try to take her chances, perhaps escape in the chaos of the battle? It was a choice that would define everything. And Erika knew that whatever path she chose, it could be the last decision she ever made. The air was thick with tension, the sounds of distant gunfire growing louder. Something was about to break. The camp had descended into chaos. The air was thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder and the distant sounds of gunfire echoing through the trees. Screams and shouts reverberated in the distance. But for Erika, it all felt muffled, as if the world around her was moving in slow motion. Her heart was racing, each beat pounding in her chest, drowning out everything else. She stood frozen, her eyes darting around the chaos, trying to make sense of it all. Sergeant Anderson stood beside her, his face grim, his eyes scanning the perimeter. His hands were shaking slightly, but his voice remained firm as he barked orders to the other soldiers. "We have to move now," he shouted. But Erika didn't move. She couldn't. Every part of her wanted to stay where she was, to trust him, but something was gnawing at her insides, a cold, crawling suspicion. She had watched him closely over the past few days. He had been kind, but kindness didn't always mean safety. The way he spoke to the other soldiers now, the urgency in his commands, there was something in his eyes that had changed, something cold and distant. She could hear the others moving behind her, soldiers shouting to one another, their voices panicked, their orders becoming more erratic as the gunfire grew louder. But there was no time to process it. The women were being rushed toward the back of the camp, ordered to remain low, to stay hidden. Yet the sounds of the battle felt too close, too real. The walls of the camp were not as solid as they seemed. The safety they had felt was now a distant memory, replaced by the raw terror of being trapped in the middle of a battle they had never expected to be part of. And then, just as the soldiers began to move toward the edge of the camp, the real horror arrived. A group of German soldiers, hidden among the trees, had breached the perimeter. Their figures emerged from the smoke, moving swiftly, their weapons drawn. The Americans had not been ready for them. They were outnumbered, their defenses scattered, and before anyone could react, the German soldiers opened fire. The first shot rang out, followed by a barrage of gunfire that sent Erika and the others ducking to the ground. The world exploded in a flash of deafening noise, and the earth seemed to shake beneath her. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke, and Erika could barely hear anything over the pounding of her own heartbeat. She instinctively pressed herself against the dirt, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. "Get down!" Anderson shouted, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. He grabbed Erika's arm, pulling her further into the shadow of a nearby tree. Everything happened so quickly. The German soldiers moved in, their guns blazing, cutting through the chaos like a blade. Erika watched in shock as one of the American soldiers fell, his body crumpling to the ground with a dull thud. The panic spread like wildfire. There was no organization, no plan, just confusion. The women were no longer safe. The safety they had felt just moments ago had vanished, replaced by the brutal reality of war. They were trapped between two forces, neither of which cared whether they lived or died. It was every woman for herself now. Erika's mind was a whirlpool of thoughts, of fear, of anger, of confusion. She wanted to move, wanted to escape, but her body was frozen, her mind too slow to react. The sound of gunfire was deafening, a constant roar in her ears. Every time she tried to breathe, the air felt too thin, too thick with smoke and tension. She looked to her side and saw Ingrid crouching beside her, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. Ingrid's hand was shaking as she clutched Erika's arm, her grip tight and desperate. "We need to go," Ingrid whispered, her voice trembling. "Now!" Erika nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't stay in the line of fire. But where could they go? The perimeter was surrounded, and the camp was descending into chaos. There was no clear path to safety. In that moment, Erika made a decision. It was a choice born of instinct, a decision she knew she might not survive, but it was the only choice she had left. "Stay low," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. She grabbed Ingrid's hand and began to move, pulling her forward through the smoke and confusion. They ran, crouching low to the ground, moving between the scattered tents and buildings. The sounds of gunfire and shouting surrounded them, but Erika didn't look back. She couldn't. She knew the others were following, but the only thing that mattered now was getting out. Suddenly, a shout pierced the air. One of the American soldiers had spotted them. "Hey!" the soldier yelled, pointing in their direction. "Stop! Get back here!" But Erika didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She pushed Ingrid forward, urging her to run faster, her heart thundering in her chest. And then, just as they reached the edge of the camp, everything exploded into chaos. Another shot rang out, and Erika felt a searing pain in her side. She gasped, stumbling forward as her knees buckled beneath her. Blood was seeping through her uniform, warm and sticky. "Ingrid!" she cried, but her voice was weak, barely a whisper. She tried to stand, tried to keep moving, but the pain was too much. She felt herself falling, her vision blurring at the edges. Her body hit the ground with a sickening thud. Ingrid was beside her in an instant, her hands trembling as she tried to help Erika up. But Erika could barely hold on to her. The world was spinning, and her breath came in ragged gasps. "Erika, no! You have to stay with me!" Ingrid cried, her voice panicked. Erika's vision was fading, the pain in her side growing duller. She wanted to tell Ingrid to run, to leave her behind, but the words wouldn't come. She felt her body go limp, her strength slipping away. And then, through the haze, Erika heard a voice. one she recognized. Sergeant Anderson. "Get her to safety!" he shouted, his voice full of urgency. He appeared from behind the smoke, his face set in determination as he knelt beside Erika. His hands were gentle but firm as he pulled her up, cradling her in his arms. "I'm not leaving you," he said, his voice tight. "We'll get you out of here." But Erika could feel her body growing colder. The world around her seemed to slow, the sounds of the battle becoming distant and muffled. She knew that time was running out. There was only one thing she could do now. With what little strength she had left, Erika whispered, "Go. Take Ingrid. Get out." And in that moment, she made a decision. She had fought for so long, had endured so much. But she wasn't going to let this be the end of everything. She wouldn't let the war take her life. As Sergeant Anderson hesitated, his gaze locked on hers, Erika knew what needed to be done. He could save the others. He could save Ingrid. "Go," she whispered once more, her voice barely audible. "Save them." And with that, she let go. The camp fell silent in the wake of her sacrifice. The battle raged on around them. But for Erika, it was over. The world faded away, leaving only the echoes of the lives she had touched. For the others, it was the beginning of a new journey, one fraught with uncertainty, but with the promise of survival. The price of freedom, it seemed, had been steep. The world moved in strange, fragmented flashes for Erika. Her last conscious moments were a blur of smoke and noise, of pain and confusion. She could hear the distant sounds of gunfire, the shouts of soldiers, but they all seemed far away, as if they were part of some other world. The darkness that had crept in around her finally closed in, and for a brief moment, she thought she had slipped away from it all. But then, as if by some miracle, she awoke. The light was dim, and the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic. She could hear the faint murmur of voices in a soft bed beneath her. Her body felt heavy, her side aching with every shallow breath she took. She tried to move but winced in pain. A wave of weakness flooded over her, and she closed her eyes, trying to gather her strength. "Erika, you're awake." It was Ingrid's voice, trembling with relief. Erika opened her eyes slowly, her vision still blurred, but there was no mistaking the familiar face that leaned over her. Ingrid's face, filled with concern and gratitude. Erika swallowed hard, trying to speak, but her throat was dry. She had no words to explain what had happened. The camp, the soldiers, the battle, it all seemed like a distant dream now, far removed from the reality of the soft bed she lay on. "We're out of the camp," Ingrid continued, her voice a little stronger now. "The Americans got us out. You saved us, Erika. You kept us safe. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't made that choice." Erika felt her heart tighten, a lump forming in her throat. She had done it. She had chosen to stay behind, to ensure the others could escape. In that final moment, she had known what she had to do. It was a choice she would never regret, no matter the cost. But the cost had been steep. She could feel the weight of it now, the sharp pain in her side, the brokenness that lingered in every muscle. Her body had been shattered, but it was her spirit that ached the most. She had fought for something bigger than herself. But at what cost? Was the sacrifice worth it? And yet, as she lay there, in the quiet of the makeshift medical tent, a sense of peace settled over her. She had done what was right, and in that moment, that was enough. As the days passed, the reality of her situation began to sink in. She was no longer a prisoner. She had been saved by the very people she had once seen as her enemies, the Americans, whose kindness had felt so foreign, so impossible in the midst of war. But now they were the ones who had given her a second chance. They had offered her a chance to live when all seemed lost. But it wasn't just the Americans who had helped her. It was the women who had shared her struggle, who had fought beside her. Ingrid had stayed with her, had never once left her side. They had been through so much together, and in the end, it was their unity, their bond, that had allowed them to survive. Erika had not been alone. She had never been alone. In the days that followed, Erika's wounds slowly healed, but it was the emotional scars that would take longer to mend. She had witnessed the horrors of war, the betrayal, the brutality, but she had also seen the moments of humanity, the kindness that could exist even in the darkest of times. She had learned that there was no clear line between good and evil, between friend and foe. Everyone was capable of both, and it was the choices we made that defined us. The camp had fallen silent. The war had ended, but its effects were still rippling across the world. The women who had once been prisoners of war were now free, but they would never be the same. The scars of war would linger in their hearts forever, but so too would the lessons they had learned. Erika looked out over the horizon, the sun setting in the distance. She thought of her family, of the life she had lost, of the world she had known before the war had come crashing down. But she also thought of the future, of the hope that could still be found in the smallest of gestures, like a bottle of Coca-Cola, a scoop of ice cream, and a moment of humanity shared between strangers. The battle for survival had been hard, but it was the battle for the soul that had been the most difficult. And in the end, it was the choices she had made that would define her. Not as a soldier, not as a prisoner, but as a human being. As Erika lay back against the soft pillow, she closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the day wash over her. She had survived, and in surviving she had learned that even in the darkest times, there was always a chance for redemption, a chance to make things right. During the war, many German prisoners of war were held in camps throughout the United States, where they were treated with unexpected kindness by their captors. In some cases, American soldiers provided prisoners with small comforts such as food and drink, luxuries that many had never imagined would be available to them. These moments of humanity, amidst the horrors of war, became symbols of the possibility of reconciliation and healing, even in the most unlikely places.